Hello, folks. Welcome to Humanity Now podcast. Today we are talking with Dave Ranney. Dave is a longtime activist, writer, and retired professor of urban planning at University of Illinois Chicago. He is the author of 4 books, including Global Decisions, Local Collisions, and New World Disorder. His most recent book, Living and Dying on the Factory Floor, From the Outside In and the Inside Out, is what we will be discussing today. Thank you, Dave, for joining today's podcast. How are you?
I'm fine, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So I want to start with let's set the backdrop of the book for the audience. It starts in 1970 when you moved from Iowa to Chicago. What prompted that move, and how did you end up working in the factories?
Well, I was in Iowa City at the University of Iowa. We had a very vibrant political movement there, centered around the civil rights movements in the Vietnam War. But I continuously was dissatisfied with that as a place to do political work, and was invited by an organization called New American Movement to help move their organization down from Minneapolis to Chicago. And I did that, and I took a leave from my faculty position, but I really didn't want to go back at the time. They wanted me to go back, so I stayed there, and I eventually joined the Sojourner Truth Organization and worked with a friend of mine named Kingsley Clark, who had established a Workers' Rights Center, a pro bono legal walk-in storefront. But I ran out of money, and most of the people who came into the Workers' Rights Center were working in factories in South Chicago. And so when I ran out of money, I decided to see if I could work at one of those factories.
Cool. You had never worked at a factory before. What was the first day on the job like?
It was terrifying. You've never even been in a factory. I pretty much made up my work record. I didn't tell people I had been a college professor because that would have set off alarm bells. And so I knew nothing, and learned on the job. And along the way, I was in factories for 7.5 years. During that time, I picked up quite a few skills, but the first period of time was pretty rough.
Yeah, I bet. Can you please tell the audience about some of the factories that you worked at?
Yes, I worked at 7 factories in all, but some for very brief periods of time. But the main ones were I worked at a chemical plant called Foseco Corporation that made materials that were used by the steel mills to make steel. I worked at a railroad freight car factory called Thrall Car as a welder, sometimes welding for 12 hours a day. I worked at a paper cup factory called Solo Cup, where I was a welder and a machine mechanic. And then I worked at a plant called Chicago Shortening, which is really the main place that I talk about in the book, where I was a mechanic and a maintenance person.
Cool. The issues of race often come up in our society, and they come up in the factories that you worked in. Can you talk about a little bit about the different divisions in the workplace?
Yeah, so it was different at different places. At both Solo Cup and Chicago Shortening, there were sizable number of Mexican workers. At Chicago Shortening, there were a lot of black workers. So at Chicago Shortening, the racism of the management against both the blacks and the Mexicans was pretty unbelievable. I originally naively answered an ad in the paper that was looking for somebody at Chicago Shortening. They gave me a test that made use of really a high school education, a good high school education would have been sufficient. But the test had very little to do with the job, I discovered later. Anyway, I did well on the test. They hired me, and then discovered that workers in the plant had, both black and Mexican, had applied for the job and hadn't been able to pass the test, which was designed for that purpose. At Solo Cup, particularly, there was an issue with immigration and general discrimination against Latinos. Some Mexican workers at Solo Cup attempted to form a union there. There was a company that was dead set against unions, and they began to threaten workers with immigration and began just simply firing those that were central to the union, and so that they were able to get rid of the union. And they paid off the company eventually. The company paid off the union to withdraw, and that was sort of that. There was also an attempted raid at Chicago Shortening that I talk about in the book, but it shows how those workers were very vulnerable. At Thrall Car, most of the workers there were black and white, and we occupied different parts of the locker room, and that's discussed in the book. But there was a large contingent of preachers who were studying to be preachers at a large fundamentalist college that was nearby, and I found them to be very racist towards the blacks, and very overtly so, which was interesting. And then at the chemical plant called Fosico, most of the Latino workers were Guatemalan. There weren't any black workers, and there weren't any women workers. They're just white and Guatemalan. And again, the tensions were between the whites and the Guatemalans and the way the management treated the Guatemalans. There was a lot of racial tension at Chicago Shortening between blacks and Latinos, and I talk about that quite a bit in the book.
Right. And I'm sure there was a pay difference, too, at these different jobs based on race, too.
Yeah, although that wasn't real extreme. The main thing is that particularly at a place like Chicago Shortening, all of the lowest pay grade was all Mexican, and the next lowest was black. And then after that, there were the maintenance people. There was one Mexican among the maintenance people. It was basically a white job. So the assignment to job classifications really determined pay.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. You met a lot of different characters over the years at the different factories. Can you tell us some of them, especially Charles?
Yes, I'll start with Charles. Well, at Chicago Shortening, there were really two different places where people took their breaks. There was a locker room, three places. There was the locker room where the blacks took their breaks and got dressed in the morning. There was a section right on the factory floor where Mexicans gathered, and then there was a special room for the maintenance people, which was virtually all white. And I chose, after a brief period of time, to eat in the locker room, which brought out a lot of interesting interactions. And at first, there was hostility to me doing that, and then we all kind of got to like each other. And I made friends with a number of workers there through the interaction during break times. And one of these was a guy named Charles, who was really a natural leader of people, but he had a very hard drinking and drug abuse problem, which made him rather unpredictable. But when push came to shove and we had a wildcat strike that I talk about quite a bit in the book, Charles emerged as a leader. He stopped drinking, stopped taking drugs, and he really stepped forward. Unfortunately, he was out of work under a disability problem where he got injured on the job at the time we went on strike, but it didn't make it impossible for him to be with us on the picket line, and he was very much with us. But when we lost the strike, the company had to take him back. And when he went back, he got into a fight with one of the workers who'd scabbed on the strike, beat the guy up pretty bad, but then later the guy ambushed him right in the plant and killed him. Wow. So there was murder, and that was for me, that was a tremendous, traumatic event in my life. And I discussed that in the book as well.
Yes, and hence the living and dying on the factory floor. That's so sad that he was murdered like that.
Yeah, and then the other dying on the factory floor were accidents. I mean, at Thrall Car, there was an accident which 2 workers were killed on the job by a pile of steel. They kept steel in the big yard, and when they were moving the sheets of steel, they fell on them and killed them.
Wow.
And there was a lot of danger on really all of these jobs, particularly at Thrall Car, but also at the chemical plant and at Chicago Shortening. There was a lot of danger.
Yeah, well, you got injured a couple times, right?
Yes, yeah. I had a pretty bad injury at Chicago Shortening, which I talk about in detail, and I talk about it because it shows how accidents on the job happen. The worker, of course, is blamed for it, but in my case, and I think every accident I've ever seen, was because management was hurrying the workers and overloading them. And I had been asked to unplug a line that had been plugged with shortening, and I did that by turning on steam and putting it under pressure with a pump. And then they called me away to 2 other jobs, and I came back an hour later and not remembering that I had turned the steam on. And when I began to remove a cap from the pump to see what was going on, it blew up, and I got burned very badly. I was in the hospital.
Wow, that's horrible. Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit. Did you, I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about more of the division between workers. And one fact that came out in the book was that one of the factories you worked in was outside of the city, and outside of the city there was a big division in where people lived. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yes, this was Thrall Car, it was called, the railroad car factory. Many of the workers, the white workers, came from Indiana and from all white suburbs that were nearby the plant, while the black workers all came from what they call the south suburbs in Chicago, which are small communities that have always been all black. So, and there was no mingling of workers between those cities. Black workers weren't allowed in some of the towns that they came from. And then I mentioned there was this fundamentalist Christian school nearby that was virtually all white.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we talked briefly about the strike. Why don't we get into that a little bit more? The strike at the shortening factory. That's one of the big highlights of the book. Um, we don't want to give the book away, but can you talk a little bit about the strike and what happened there?
Sure, sure. It was, I think, the highlight of the book and of my time in the factories. We lost the strike, but I think a lot was learned from that, and a lot was gained in many ways. But what happened is that over a period of time, I picked this up from hanging out in the locker room. There was tremendous resentment toward the company, their arbitrary treatment of people, and really bad health care program, and the union, which people considered quite useless. But the company and union announced that they were going to reopen the contract and negotiate a new contract before the old one was finished. And the workers were very skeptical about this. They wanted to be involved in the negotiations of the contract, and they were really kind of thwarted in the whole thing. And when we had the vote on the contract, it was a terrible contract. The company had it in the shop floor. They had a little box, and we wrote yes or no and stuck it in the box. And then the box was supposed to be locked between shifts in a room, and we assigned people to guard that room and make sure nobody went in there, and got the company and union to agree to that. But at one point, they called all the workers for a big meeting on the shop floor, in which the president of the company argued that someone had called his home and threatened him and threatened his wife and so forth. It was a ploy, I'm sure, and they made the person who was guarding the locked room be part of that meeting. And so when they counted the votes, anyway, the union contract was passed. We did an exit poll and discovered everybody claimed that they had voted against the contract. So we demanded another vote on that would be supervised, in a regular manner. And the company not only refused, but I got called in up to the administrative offices. They had this big PA system in the plant, so everybody knew I was going up there. And when I got up there, I found my union business agent up there. And he chastised me for stirring up, and then he used the N-word about his workers, and we got into a big argument, and I got kind of knocked around, not beat up bad, but enough to bruise my face, and went back to the shop floor, and I wasn't going to say anything initially because I didn't want to be the one to start another action. But the workers saw me, and as soon as I told them what had happened, they went rushing up to the administrative offices. The union business agent was running down the street, and they followed him, and he jumped in his car, and somebody broke the window out of the back of his car, and the workers came back into the plant and to a person called for a strike, and we just shut the whole place down immediately. Wow. So it was a wildcat. It went on for 2.5 weeks. And during that time, I was really impressed with the fact that the workers self-organized themselves. There was no union to make signs, or there were no strike benefits, but people all pitched in, and they organized shifts for pickets, and it really was quite an experience. And as I said, Charles stepped up as one of the leaders. Other people stepped up as leaders, and we really gave them a run for their money. We eventually lost the strike, but there were a lot of incidents on the picket line. And, one that I often read when I'm doing a reading of the book is by Charles, when we were on a railroad track where they were trying to pull railroad cars full of product out of the railroad yard, and we blocked that. And they called the police, and they had all these police in riot gear, and they had a huge cop in the front who was telling us that we had to leave or we'd all be arrested. And Charles stepped forward and looked this guy right in the eye, and he said, this is about how we're going to feed our babies, and that's something worth fighting for. So moving us out of here, it ain't going to be easy, he said. And
Wow.
They backed at that point anyway. So I always have remembered that. And he was able to really galvanize the other workers by that action.
Right. And I remember you telling me that the racial divisions during the strike seemed to disappear. There was even a Nazi that was involved in the strike.
Yeah, or at least he said he was a Nazi. He was a very curious guy. He was the only other white guy that struck. And what was really amazing to me was that the first night of the picket, all the blacks were grumbling that the Mexicans would run away the first sign of trouble, and all the Mexicans were grumbling that the blacks would all get drunk and not come to the picket. But when we had our first night of the picket, everybody was there, and there was a lot of food brought, and people started sharing food. Mexicans were sharing food with black workers, and so it was this amazing shift. And then as the strike went on, and workers realized that their characterization of the other group was not right, that really that all went away, at least for the duration of the strike. I'm not sure what happened later, or whether it didn't certainly solve the underlying issues, but it did show that class interests at that point really prevailed over these racial antagonisms.
Right.
And people actually liked each other once they got a chance to get to know them, and picket line's a good place to do that.
Right. Well, I want to mention to the audience that you did an amazing interview on Doug Storm's radio program, Interchange. You can find the radio program in the comments below, so you can go and listen to that interview. There will be a link. I want to change gears a little bit and discuss some of the subjects that come out of your book. In the book, you discuss the political organizations that you were in. Can you tell us a little bit about the organizations that you were in back then?
Yeah, well, I mentioned the New American Movement. That's where I started in Chicago. Actually, I was a member of that when I was in Iowa. It was a new organization that had come out of SDS and was what they called at the time, this was in the early 1970s, a multi-tendency organization. That different chapters really had quite different socialist politics. There was Social Democrats, there were Maoists, there were all kinds of different flavors of leftists, and they were pretty much represented in different chapters, and it was national. So there was a chapter that was pretty much Marxist-Leninist, but focused on healthcare issues, and they were in North Carolina. And then, there were different ones. And a chapter in Chicago did not have too much of a unifying theme, but the social democracy was the prevailing view. But then I ran into the people of Sojourner Truth Organization and liked their ideas better, and suggested that they form a chapter and be part of NAM, which they did. And so then I moved my allegiance to Sojourner Truth Organization. NAM really got dominated by a social democrat point of view. Many of the veterans of that are now part of DSA. But Sojourner Truth Organization was founded by a number of people, and it was very influenced by CLR James, which I'll talk about in a moment, but and the racial ideas of Noel Ignatieff, and some of the organizational ideas of a guy named Don Hammerquist. One hallmark of STO was the view that the Soviet Union at that time and China were not really socialists, but were state capitalists, and that there was a critique of the party structure of the Communist Party, of the Vanguard Party, and we had an alternative form of organization. And then on race, Noel Ignatieff is well known among many people for his book, How the Irish Became White. But before that, he was very active with a guy named Ted Allen in SDS, and they wrote a polemic regarding treatment of race in revolutionary politics, where it wasn't a matter of unite and fight, but it was a matter that white people had to give up their privileges because race was a social construct that was designed to keep black workers and white workers apart. And Noel and Ted articulated that in a polemic called White Blind Spot in STS. Later, Noel went on to form the journal Race Trader, and then another journal that still exists called Hardcrackers. But Race Trader's motto was that traitor to the white race is loyalty to humanity. And I think that kind of sums up what those politics were. So I was in that. CLR James was not part of that, but his ideas were very influential. And CLR James, along with two other people, Raya Dunayevskaya and Grace Lee Boggs, very much had the state capitalist position regarding the parties, but they came out of a tendency that broke from the Trotskyist movement, that wrote a book called State Capitalism and World Revolution that articulated this notion of state capitalism. But also CLR argued that ordinary people express the seeds of socialism in their everyday encounters with the capitalist system. Raya Dunayevskaya and CLR broke at some point in the 50s, in the 1950s. But what she added to that discussion was that while it was true that ordinary people offer the seeds of socialism in their opposition to capitalism on a day-to-day basis, but that needed to be met by revolutionaries with a movement from theory that was a form of philosophy. So her formulation was there's a movement from practice that is a form of theory, but there's also a movement from theory that's a form of philosophy that speaks to what the revolution is for. And that really played out in very practical terms on a day-to-day basis. And that was really more of my own guideline, I eventually left STO and joined News and Letters. And News and Letters was founded by Raya Dunayevskaya. I don't know whether that's enough.
Well, that's great. No, it was very informative. The thing I wanted to address was you talked a little bit about it in the book was radical groups, organizations working in the factories, that idea of political organizations embedding themselves into the working class to help agitate for change. Those days seem to be over. Can you please talk to this?
Yeah, I don't know whether they are over, but I will speak to it. Yes, at that time, this would have been the 70s and early 80s, maybe late 60s actually. There was a lot of upheaval on the factory floors. Now a lot of the upheaval is in other arenas, particularly in the logistics area and companies like Amazon. But then it was really heavy industries, steel mills, some of the light industry, like the places I worked, where black workers particularly were taking a lead in challenging we thought challenging capitalism itself. And so, it was very exciting. Well, a lot of the political groups began to put their people into factories, and they wanted them to agitate among the workers to get them to do certain things that they thought made sense, and also to use that as a vehicle to recruit workers into their organizations. And they had this, what I considered a shocking term, which they actually called that colonization. I don't know whether they fully grasped the historic significance of that term. But anyway, they did that. But STO did not. And I went into the factories when I was in STO, and News and Letters was the same. That we did have this perspective that the everyday encounters of workers with capitalism, there's expressions that come out of that can foresee what a new society might look like and can be building blocks. And our job was to, first of all, recognize those things and to bring them out with others who don't have firsthand knowledge of them, and to use that as the basis to talk about with workers larger political issues. So that is sort of what I did. So, for instance, when we had the strike at Chicago shortening, I did get people that I had been working with, some who were Iranian students who had the Iranian Students Association that was agitating at that time to get rid of the Shah of Iran. And that was very much contested by which was then a monarchy in Iran. And it was quite a militant kind of activity. And then there were a number of radical Puerto Ricans who were independentistas for independence and socialism in Puerto Rico that I had worked with. And they all came down to the picket line. We really had an opportunity after they had been picketing for a while to sit down together and talk about, many of the workers had never even heard of Iran, or they knew of Puerto Rico, but they had no idea about this issue. And they took to it. I mean, they really understood it, and they related it to their own experience on the job. And that's the way of broadening out something like the Wildcat strike at a cooking oil factory to talk about Iran and talk about Puerto Rico and U.S. foreign policy and a lot of other things.
Wow, that's amazing. What amazing times that was back then. What you just said about that reminds me of what you told me before about CLR James' saying of record and, what was the saying? Record and...
And record.
Can you say that again, please?
Recognize and record.
Yeah.
It's there was a book that CLR wrote called Facing Reality, and it was about the Hungarian uprising in the 50s. And in that, he talked about the signs of socialism, of real socialism, in the rebellion of Hungarian people against the Soviet communist regime. And he coined that term, recognize and record. There were a lot of instances, and in many ways my book is the recording part of that, where I talk about it. I just lay it out there in the book. I don't really go and discuss at length, but just telling the stories themselves, people can recognize that. And I want to mention there's what I consider a sister book or a brother book or whatever that Nolan wrote that I helped edit after he died, that's called Acceptable Men. And he tells stories in Acceptable Men about his time at U.S. Steel Gary Works. And I was really struck in working on the book at, how much, even though he was in a very, very different kind of place, but how those elements of people resisting capitalist work processes on the job, for instance, went on everywhere. And that he was very much, Noel was really influenced by C.L.R. James. And I was too, to some extent, but also by Raya. That I think is an obligation to see those things, and a lot of people don't see them.
Right. Well, that's the point of this, is to see it and to record it and hopefully do something about it. What do you see for this generation now? What can we do in our workplaces to try to influence our coworkers or the situation at work, do you think?
Well, I think it's just encouraging things that many people are already doing. I mean, to really understand that concept, that I don't think that's adequate to change society, to just simply look at what people are doing and write about it. But to be encouraging, here's an example. I've often thought about the fact that in the Chicago shortening strike, I thought when they shut down the plant that this was going to be one hell of a struggle, because we were up against a union that had definite mafia connections. We were up against a company that had mafia connections. They had a lot of money and a lot of firepower. And I knew that it was going to be a rough go. So what do? Do you say, well, wait a minute, maybe we should think about this? But I didn't. I thought, okay, this is clearly something that I didn't agitate for. This is something that the workers have wanted to do for many years, and let's go for it. And to keep my ears open and be mindful about the self-organization that went on, for instance, in that strike, and how race came to be pushed aside in favor of class in that particular context, and to encourage it. So I think that carries through to today. These things are happening in many different kinds of workplaces, and certainly I mentioned the logistics sector. That is very important at this point. There still is manufacturing. It hasn't gone away. It certainly has diminished from what it was in the 70s, but that's very important. There's linkage. There can be better linkages among struggles in different parts of the world, because the capitalism has really taken on a different form of organization since the 1970s, and that now capital is completely mobile. We're seeing with this Ukraine situation that how interconnected all of the NATO countries are with Russia, and it's like pulling teeth to even try to stop all the horrible bombing that's going on there, and to go that far. So there are groups of workers in different parts of the world that are resisting capitalism, and that's what we should be focused on.
Yes, absolutely. So we're gonna end the podcast shortly, but I just wanted to say a few things. First of all, your book is a classic. I see it being read in schools for generations. It was an honor to interview you, Dave. But I want to let the people know where you can get the book at. It's available on Amazon. It's also a Kindle version, and now there's a new audiobook edition available at Amazon, Spotify, and Apple, and that's actually, the book is read by Doug Storm. So that's a great way to hear the book, but we encourage you to read it. Do you have anything you want to say before we end the...
Well, just that it's also available at PM Press. PM Press published that, and they can get it off of their website. And that Noel's book, which I mentioned, Acceptable Men, I'd encourage people to also think of reading that. It's a short book. Mine's not very long either. And that's available from Charles H. Kerr Press. And also is available at the different venues that you just mentioned with regard to my book. So I think that's good enough, and I really appreciate you asking me to be on, and for your kind words about the book, and I hope people enjoy it.
They certainly will if they read it. Thank you very much.